Good afternoon. It's been a real pleasure to introduce Professor Anthony Fauci, who is a physician scientist who directs the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. He oversees an extensive research program on infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS, influenza, TB, Ebola, and Zika, as well as diseases of the immune system. Tony also serves as one of the key advisors of the White House and Department of Health and Human Services on global infectious diseases issues. He was one of the principal architects of the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, also known as PEPFAR, a program that has saved millions of lives throughout the developing world. Dr. Fauci is also the longtime chief of the NIAID Laboratory of Immunoregulation, where he has made numerous important discoveries related to HIV/AIDS and is one of the most cited scientists in the field. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Science and the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, and has received numerous prestigious awards for his scientific and global health accomplishment, including the National Medal of Science, the Robert Koch Medal, the Mary Woodward Lasker Award for Public Service, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He has been awarded 45 honorary doctoral degrees, and he is the author, co-author, or editor of more than 1,300 scientific publications, including several major textbooks. This is what is written here in the text. Let me say that also Tony Fauci is an extraordinary person, a good friend, and is also one of the best speakers in the field. So please help me to receive Dr. Tony Fauci.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon to talk about this important subject, as you see on this first slide, the durable control of HIV infection in the absence of antiretroviral therapy, some of the opportunities that we're faced with, as well as some of the formidable obstacles. Before I start, I would like to dedicate this lecture to Bonnie Matheson, a dear friend and mentor to so many of us, who died suddenly and unexpectedly this past year. She was the former head of the vaccine program of the NIH Office of AIDS Research. Now, there are two pathways to what I refer to as the sustained ART-free HIV remission. The first is what we classically refer to as a cure, which would require eradicating the replication-competent HIV reservoir. As we know throughout the years and from several presentations at this meeting, there are a number of approaches of these, many of which are problematic, almost all of which except one have been unsuccessful, ranging from latency-reversing agents to deplete the reservoir, to modified antibodies and or effector cells such as CAR T cells, gene editing, and the one success that we've seen with Timothy Brown, namely the stem cell transplantation. I am not going to go over this during my presentation today, except to make one comment of something that we need to consider as we continue this important research, and that is to consider the risk-benefit ratio of attempts at eradication, which can be risky to the patient, sometimes non-scalable, in fact, probably non-scalable, and very often expensive. The reason I say that is because you have to balance eradication versus the fact that with one pill a day, you can successfully, in many patients, as we have experience now, suppress the virus low to below detectable level. And as shown here, there are 11 formulations in one pill that can actually deliver 3 antiretroviral agents. So we must keep that in mind. Moving on to the subject of my discussion this afternoon, that is the control of viral rebound without eradication of HIV in the absence of antiretroviral therapy, which I will refer to as sustained virological remission. Now, the optimal criteria that I would empirically put before you to maintain practically an ART-free remission for HIV infection without direct eradication is that it must be of low risk to the patient, it must be scalable, and potentially and optimally, it would hopefully lead to the induction of durable immune-mediated control of virus. So I'm going to take two tacks with you this afternoon. The first is to discuss an ART-free remission that would require intermittent or continual non-ART intervention. So although you may be ART-free, you're not intervention-free. So let's take a look at a couple of possibilities there, as shown on this slide. The first is the possibility of inducing post-infection by a therapeutic vaccination that could be given intermittently over several years that could control virus without ART. Unfortunately, if one looks at the literature as reviewed in this article from 2 years ago, in placebo-controlled studies that included interruption of ART to determine efficacy, which is critical, the proof of the pudding is always analytical treatment interruption, there have been no successful therapeutic vaccines that we know of. Despite this, we reported about 7 months ago a randomized, placebo-controlled safety efficacy of a therapeutic vaccine in HIV-infected individuals who were treated with ART early in the course of their infection. The protocol is shown here. It was a prime boost with plasmids with multiple HIV inserts together with an adjuvant followed by a VSV boost. The trigger point to restart following ART was a rise of virus to greater than 50,000 copies sustained for 4 weeks. And then we looked at virological points for comparison with other studies, such as how long you remain less than 40 or 400 copies. As shown on this slide, in this placebo-controlled study, when one looked at the time to rebound, there was absolutely no difference between the vaccine and the placebo-controlled group. I want to point out to you the dark blue bar on the right-hand part of the slide of 2 of the individuals who were in the placebo group who went on for extended period of time measured in 1 to 2.5 years, which is one of the reasons why we have to be careful when we do studies that we take a look at what placebo itself could do. We went on to look, perhaps there was a hint there about how long these individuals remained less than 40 or less than 400 copies, and again, no difference between placebo and the vaccine itself. So that was disappointing. I want to spend a few minutes now on something that I think is very promising that needs to be actively pursued. And that is the passive transfer of broadly neutralizing anti-HIV monoclonal antibodies, referred to as BNABs. We know now from years of experience that if one looks at the HIV envelope trimer, there are major sites which broadly neutralizing antibodies recognize. We refer to these as neutralizing epitopes. And the recognized ones are shown on this slide. Over the years, a number of broadly neutralizing antibodies have been isolated and cloned from HIV-infected individuals and have been shown to bind individually to these neutralizing epitopes. So the question is, if you passively transfer them, can you actually substitute an intervention like antibody for daily ART? The first studies that were done are shown on this slide. They were reported almost simultaneously, one from Michelle Nutzensweig's group using 3B and C117, and then a publication which was combined studies done separately from Pablo Tabas's lab and my own lab at NIH using VRC01. And as you can see, if we passively transferred in people on ART and then discontinued ART, we looked at the delay in rebound. And in fact, if you use the historical control, which was 11 to 28 days, compared to the plasma viral rebound with the group with the antibody, it indeed was delayed. Now that's a start, but it certainly is not the end game. So what do we need to do now if we're going to achieve this as an alternative treatment? They're listed on this slide. So let me very briefly go through each of these. More potent antibodies. If you look again at this HIV envelope trimer, there's a large number of antibodies with varying potencies and varying breadth. If you plot the breadth and the potency shown here, it is clear that there are some antibodies that are more potent than others and have greater breadth than others. So the trick in the future is to pick those antibodies that have high breadth and high potency. The next is, it would be ideal to be able to give intermittently over an extended period of time instead of every couple of months, which we do now, and that is to extend the half-life of the antibodies. This can be rather easily done by a simple mutation in the Fc portion of the antibody known as the LS mutation. On the right-hand part of the slide, in black, you see the pharmacokinetics of VRC01 in its wild type compared to the prolonged pharmacokinetics of VRC01 that has been mutated for longer half-life. Another possibility is vector-based antibody production. This was pioneered by David Baltimore and reported several years ago, in which adeno-associated virus delivered a 4E10 monoclonal antibody in a humanized mice, something to be seriously considered. But probably most important, and that which will get us the most bang for the buck, is combinations of antibodies. So let's take a little bit historical journey. You may remember in the early years of HIV, when the HIV replication cycle was delineated, it became clear that there were multiple independent targets of various antiretroviral drugs, as shown on the slide. Over the years, we developed many, now more than 30, antiretroviral drugs aimed at different targets on the replication cycle. If you look historically, from 1981 to 1986, I took care of hundreds and hundreds of HIV-infected individuals and had no direct antiretroviral therapy. But in 1987 with AZT, we had the first drug that dropped viral load with a very poor duration. A few years later, with 2 drugs, we dropped the viral load even greater, certainly not to undetectable, again with modest duration. And it was the transforming year of 1996, which was ushered in with the protease inhibitors, and now with even better drugs than protease inhibitors, we can drop the viral load to undetectable and keep it there essentially indefinitely. Why not the same principle with broadly neutralizing antibodies? Here again is the HIV envelope trimer with the multiple neutralizing epitopes. One can then formulate an approach of 1 antibody or 2 antibodies at a different site, or a 3rd antibody at a different site of neutralizing epitope, and on and on. The possibilities are extraordinary. In addition, you can have individual antibodies against individual sites, or bispecific and trispecific antibodies against HIV. This is an approach that needs to be pursued vigorously with the ultimate goal, the end game, of substituting in a very user-friendly, as it were, 6-month regimen of passive transfer of combinations of antibodies against multiple neutralizing epitopes that could replace daily antiretroviral therapy. Again, something that needs to be vigorously pursued. The alternative approach is a bit more interesting and problematic because it's requiring to induce a response that would be durable in its control of virus, that would not have to be continually given. In other words, inducing something and then backing off. What are the approaches that have been looked at? They're shown on this slide. The first one is one that we have been pursuing over the last several years, is passive transfer of antibodies to the integrin alpha-4 beta-7. Why alpha-4 beta-7? It's an integrin whose natural ligand is MADCAM, but importantly, its principal function is to mediate migration of leukocytes to the gut, an important target in the pathogenesis of HIV. So about 10 years ago, we started studying, actually 12 years ago, we started studying this, and this is the conformational structure of alpha-4 beta-7 juxtaposed against CD4. We found in an initial publication in Nature Immunology that actually the envelope binds to and signals CD4 positive T cells through alpha-4 beta-7. We went on to show that this subset of high alpha-4 beta-7 expressing cells were highly susceptible to infection with HIV, as shown on this slide, where the blue squares are beta-7 high, the low beta-7 are in red, and clearly a major difference in infectability of these cells. We and others also showed that individuals with high expressing alpha-4 beta-7 was a predictive value both in humans and monkeys in acquisition and disease progression. So what we did, since we're not a non-human primate lab, we partnered and collaborated with Tab Ansari and Francois Villager and their group at Emory and Tulane to determine if antibody to alpha-4 beta-7 could prevent infection. And in a passive transfer study, we showed that individuals who had mucosal exposure but had passive transfer of a primatized antibody against alpha-4 beta-7 not only had a decrease in infection, but the animals that did get infected had a delay in infection. We went on and did a study that was published in Science to see if you could actually induce this durable control that I mentioned just a few moments ago. And the protocol of the study was to take non-human primates, infect them for 5 weeks, treat them with ART for 13 weeks, overlapping with 8 infusions of antibody to alpha-4 beta-7, and discontinue in an analytical treatment interruption any therapy. The results were really striking. In red, you see the IgG control of the standard type of rebound, which we all see in animals when you stop ART. But in the animals who had the antibody to alpha-4 beta-7, they blipped up and down for a while, and then they had durable control for about 2 or more years. So the next thing to do was to simultaneously do 2 follow-up studies, and I want to briefly report these to you this afternoon. The first was to repeat the macaque study at the NIH with our own group led by Jeff Lisson, Mikhail Damasio, and Cliff Lane. And in fact, this was just reported yesterday during the Cure Symposium, and as Michele showed, we did not see those dramatic results at all. In fact, if you looked at the IgG control on the bottom part of the panel compared to the alpha-4 beta-7 antibody, there was not that dramatic effect. In fact, what was different in the studies was the great degree of variability of the set points to which the animals rebound, which tell us there are some interesting clues in there in differences in different animals done in different places, which I think needs to be looked at. But the proof of the pudding really is what about humans? And in that regard, we initiated a study using vedolizumab in humans. Why vedolizumab? Vedolizumab is a humanized anti-alpha-4 beta-7 monoclonal antibody that has been approved by the regulatory authorities for successful maintenance therapy in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. So what we embarked upon more than a year and a half ago was an exploratory open-label study in subjects with HIV infection who would then undergo analytical treatment interruption. 18 volunteers were studied. I want to emphasize this is an open-label study and not a randomized control study, because the purpose was to see if we had the dramatic results that were reported in the non-human primate. Our subjects were in good health, they had normal CD4 counts, and they had documented suppressed viremia for 2 or more years on combination antiretroviral therapy. There were 2 endpoints, primary and secondary. The first was safety and tolerability, because this drug had never proactively been used before in an HIV-infected population. The second objective was to evaluate whether there was a delay in rebound. Be careful now, because the secondary objective is in an open-label study, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So this is the protocol. As I mentioned, our patients had been on ART for 2 or more years. What we did was infuse passive transfer of vedolizumab over several infusions in 30 weeks. We stopped antiretroviral therapy, and we asked, was there any dramatic effect on the rebound of virus? Now, there was a restart criteria that's really important when you do human studies. If an individual had a sustained rebound of greater than 1,000 copies for more than 4 weeks, the per protocol demanded restarting ART, or a 30% decline in baseline CD4 count, or an absolute count less than 350. The primary objective was met. There were no infusion-associated adverse events and no serious adverse events related to vedolizumab. With regard to the secondary objective, remember this was an open-label study to determine a dramatic effect as seen in the Biraretti study. We did not see that. We did not see durable control. But in the absence of this dramatic effect, with no randomized control, with all the caveats, we did a post hoc analysis comparing it to comparable patients that we had been studying for years. There were 18 patients. This slide shows 10 of them. I know it's difficult to see because there are a number of patients there, but in the shaded area is the time off ART, namely the analytical treatment interruption. The blue asterisk is when we triggered putting them back on antiretroviral drug. There was a great deal of variability. I've circled in red 2 individuals on this slide. The other 8 are on this slide. And as you can see, there's a great deal of variability. I will point out that 2 of these individuals, number 12, and on this slide, number 6, never rebounded. But remember, I showed you the same thing in the placebo group from the therapeutic vaccine study. So let's take a look at these 5 representative individuals. Number 5 bounced back up, but while he was on his way down, he triggered the restart criteria because he was greater than 1,000. So we restarted therapy. Number 7 went up, but interestingly came back down, but then went back up and triggered. Number 12 never rebounded and still hasn't rebounded. Number 14 shot up and triggered the restart criteria. Number 15, for those of you who do patients, human studies, the patient went up, came back down and stayed down, but got nervous and started on therapy anyway, even though he didn't trigger the restart criteria. So now what about comparing it, since we couldn't say anything about that, since it was an open label study? So we went to our therapeutic vaccine study and looked at the placebo arm and looked at the point where those individuals would have triggered restart with 1,000 copies for 4 weeks. And as you can see from this Kaplan-Meier, there was no dramatic effect, in fact, no difference at all. You have to be careful with statistics because this is not a randomized trial, but I think if you look at this slide, it's obvious. We asked, well, what about how long they stayed less than 400 copies? And again, comparing it to the placebo limb of our therapeutic vaccine, there was no difference. Now, what could possibly be an explanation if we are going to continue these types of studies? Well, the antibodies are different because in the trimerized antibody, the FC portion is intact, whereas with vedolizumab, it's been modified for safety reasons. You don't want to have an autoreactive phenomenon. There's also differences in study design. The macaque study doesn't have any restart criteria. If they rebound, they rebound. And finally, some major differences in the host. So that's something that, if it's going to be pursued, needs to have a properly powered, randomized controlled study. But let me just finally finish on something that I think is quite promising, and that is the passive transfer of combinations of human broadly neutralizing antibodies during the acute early part of infection. And that is critical in the timing. And this relates to a study that was recently published from Mal Martin and Michelle Nutzenzweig, in which they looked at animals infected with HIV so they could use a human broadly neutralizing antibodies and treated them early in infection with just the antibody. And the study went as follows. They had 13 non-human primates infected with HIV, either intrarectally or intravenously. Within 3 days of infection, they passively transferred over 2 weeks 3 infusions of two powerful broadly neutralizing antibodies, 3BNC117 and 101074. And in a very dramatic way, after the antibodies pharmacokinetically had disappeared from the circulation, they had induced in 6 of those animals elite control, which was never seen before in prior studies. 6 had undetectable virus for more than 2 years. 4 had a much lower set point than you would have expected. In contrast, animals who were similarly infected but treated with ART, and then the ART stopped, they all rebounded as you would expect in all the studies, just like the ones I showed you before. Now, what was the mechanism? The mechanism was CD8 T-cell mediated control that was induced by the intervention of the broadly neutralizing antibodies. How did we know that? Because when you look at a depletion of CD8 positive T cells with an antibody to CD8 beta, as shown in the blue arrows, the animals rebounded, and when the CD8s came back again, they developed again the durable suppression. Another really interesting phenomenon that we need to pay attention to is that this is data that was allowed me to present to you today by Mal Martin and Rick Kaup at the NIH, when they looked at CXCR5 CD8 positive T cells in the lymph nodes of the elite control animals. There was nothing in the peripheral blood, but there was an accumulation of the CXCR5 CD8 positive T cells in the elite control, as shown on the right in green, but not on the non-controllers, not on those that received ART. Why is this potentially important? Because a recent study published last month in Science Immunology by Mike Betz's group, they looked at the lymphoid tissue of human elite controllers, and they found an increase in accumulation of CD69, CD8 positive T cells in the lymph nodes, and in fact, those CD69 positives co-express CXCR5. So what we may have essentially bumped into is a correlate of durable immunity in the lymphoid tissue that matches the elite controllers in the human with the elite controllers in the monkey model of Mal Martin and Michelle Nutzensweig. What could possibly be a mechanism of this induction? Remember, the antibody was given during an acute infection. So to have a highly potent, broadly neutralizing antibody present in the early stages of viremia, the proposal is, and I totally agree with this as a high likelihood, that immune complexes were formed, presented to the immune system, and thus induced this durable CD8 positive T-cell mediated control. So now, with broadly neutralizing antibodies available, I believe this needs to be very actively pursued. The other side of the coin is with a vaccine for uninfected individuals. If you induce broadly neutralizing antibodies and a person does get infected, it is conceivable with antibodies hanging around that you might actually be able to induce in infected individuals long-term control. So in summary, therapeutic vaccines unfortunately have failed to durably control HIV rebound following ATI. Intermittent passive transfer of long half-life broadly neutralizing antibodies in combinations of 2 or 3 aimed at different epitopes is a promising approach towards the durable control of HIV rebound in the absence of ART and should be vigorously pursued. As I just described in our open-label study with vedolizumab, it was safe and well tolerated, but we did not get the dramatic results that were seen in the animal study, and no detectable difference in time to viral rebound. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, further pursuit of this approach will require a properly powered, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. Now, passive transfer of anti-HIV antibodies during acute SHIV infection showed promising results in the induction of durable CD8-mediated control. Similar studies using these antibodies during the early stages of human infection should be actively pursued. And in conclusion, durable ART-free control of HIV viremia in the absence of eradication by a variety of minimally toxic approaches that are potentially scalable is a feasible concept that deserves vigorous pursuit. I want to end by thanking our collaborators on the therapeutic vaccine study shown on this slide, particularly Mike Snella, Kat Claridge, and Taeyuk Chun. Also, the collaborators on the alpha-4 beta-7 study in my own lab, Jim Arthus and Claudia Shikala, but also the original animal studies in Tab Ansari, Francois Villinger, Phil Santangelo, and others. And finally, the macaque study that we did at the NIH, which was reported yesterday by Michela Damasio, led by Jeff Lifton and Cliff Lane. And finally, the human vedolizumab studies, led by Mike Sneller, Taeyuk Chun, Mike Proshan, as well as Mike Schätzlein from Takeda, as well as others in the laboratory. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for a terrific talk. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador-at-Large Deborah Birx. Deborah is the coordinator of the United States government activities to combat HIV/AIDS and the U.S. Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy. Her 3-decade-long career has focused on HIV/AIDS immunology, vaccine research, and global health. As the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, Ambassador Birx oversees the implementation of the U.S. President Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, well known as PEPFAR, and all U.S. government's engagement with the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Serving as the U.S. Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy, she aligns the U.S. government's diplomacy with foreign assistance programs that addresses global health challenges and accelerate progress towards achieving an AIDS-free generation, ending preventable child and maternal death, and preventing, detecting, and responding to infectious disease threats. Please welcome Ambassador Birx.
Thank you. It's a real privilege and a little unnerving to follow Dr. Fauci, because I was in his lab as a fellow before HIV/AIDS in the time of Wegener's granulomatosis in 1982. It was a privilege to prepare for this lecture because although I knew Jonathan Mann, he was iconic to me by the time I met him. I met him through Mary Lou Clemens because Mary Lou was working on HIV vaccines and running AVEG while I was in the Department of Defense running their vaccine trials. And I really felt that out of my deep respect for Dr. Mann, I should go back and read through his original books. AIDS in the World, interestingly, published in 1992, when the last AIDS conference was here, and before the majority of the youth leaders that I was privileged to be with yesterday were born. He published a second book, AIDS in the World 2, in 1996. And he has lots of things to say to us that I think are extraordinarily relevant today. He said in 92, and this was just really 11 years into the pandemic, that the HIV/AIDS pandemic was entering a new and more dangerous phase. And as the global threat increases, there are many signs of growing complacency, persistent denial, and resurgent discrimination. What is wrong, he asked. Why is it so difficult to mobilize nations against AIDS, and what should be done? He went on to follow this to say a creative revitalization of the efforts against AIDS is needed. As the pandemic expands and intensifies, the work against it is threatened by a loss of confidence and direction. But concluded this chapter by saying that information can help liberate us from confusion and uncertainty. And I think there are times in the epidemic when we look across the globe and we see areas that aren't moving in the way that we thought they should, and other areas that are advancing, and it causes us to question what are we doing and what can we do better. And I'm going to go through some of the areas and just give you a little bit of my insights into where we can improve and what needs to be done. Where are we in Eastern and Southern Africa, where the largest burden of the disease resides? Expansion services has been constant, and when I say services, I'm talking about primary prevention services as well as treatment services, and this has been done by a really unbelievable partnership between the groups with funding, PEPFAR and the Global Fund, and the governments and communities. And we have demonstrated outcomes and impact because governments worked with rapid policy adoption and communities worked to translate those policies into reality. And together we monitored progress. Yet, there are key gaps in these areas. We need still continued expansion of prevention interventions to saturation, particularly in 15 to 30-year-old young men and women. Men of all ages are missing from the treatment cascades, and as evidenced by the MenStar Coalition, will be addressed with the $1.2 billion investment per year to really bring men into the clinical sphere. And then clinical and prevention cascades for all key populations are lacking in different areas, whether it's reaching, diagnosing, preventing, or treating. And we're asking ourselves, can we change the course of this pandemic in the time of dramatic urbanization in many countries, and when there are twice as many 15 to 24-year-olds as there are in sub-Saharan Africa entering the age of sexual debut? I call this the youth wave. There are countries where it truly is a bulge. If you look at Zimbabwe, if you look at South Africa, Namibia, they truly have a bulge that's moving through the demographic pyramid. But in places like Zambia and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, it is a wave that will continue unrelenting for the next 3 decades. But what have we learned since Jonathan Mann spoke about complacency? We've learned, as you've seen in the media center today and the press conference, that dramatic impact is possible if we fight every day against complacency, persistent denial, and resurgent discrimination, both at the level of the government and at the community, and this is what can happen. That first bar shows awareness of HIV status, the gateway to clear prevention and treatment interventions. Namibia just released their data today and has achieved full viral suppression at the 90-90-90 percentages. But across the board, you can see countries, they're getting close to over 3/4 of the population, the adult population, aware of their status. And this is in contrast to those on the other end of this graphic, Cote d'Ivoire and West Central Africa. This is the data from Eswatini, Swaziland, showing just in the last 5 years, because we had a baseline study at the population level called SHIMS. This was repeated just last year. More than 100% increase in viral load suppression in less than 5 years, and that resulted in a greater than 44% decline in new infections. Just as mentioned in the Namibia data, just 3 years ago, actually, looking at Namibia, we saw a resurgence of HIV in the north of Namibia, an area of complex rural roads, an area of different tribal entities, an area of a lot of cross-border interactions. And just in 2 years, with these policy changes that were generated from the community's needs, the viral load suppression at the community level went from 43 to 76%. This is a summary of what I just discussed, talking about population level viral load suppression, showing the dramatic work that is ongoing in a whole series of countries and the work that is yet to be done. So what are we doing? We're triangulating surveillance data and program data to identify the key gaps in the diagnosis of both well children and young adults where a key gap exists, understanding clearly what our gaps in our key populations are and where they are at risk, and then tailoring our responses to specifically addressing those gaps and holding ourselves as program managers accountable for the progress. So what are those key gaps? Well, looking across the first 7 countries that have done the FIAs, and I want to again thank CDC and Columbia ICAP and governments for really making these surveys happen, but I want to thank the people at the community who let these individuals into their households to do these surveys and draw their blood. But you can see where the gaps are. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of children that have not been diagnosed. This means our assumption that 80% of children without treatment by the age of 5 would no longer be with us is incorrect. And maybe that gave us an assurance that we had found most of the children, but we have not. And so we're missing half of the 0 to 14-year-olds, many of them well individuals, well children between the age of 8 and 14. We're also missing more than half the men. If you're between 15 and 35 in these countries, most of you do not know your status and have not interacted with the healthcare delivery system. For women, the picture is different because of the work that many countries did in instituting B+, where every woman upon diagnosis during her pregnancy received lifelong treatment. Because of that, viral load suppressions among women are far superior to those among men. We have not found the B+ for men. When we're hoping that the Manstar Coalition gives us some ideas about how to bring well men or perceive themselves to be well yet are HIV positive into the healthcare delivery system. This is our treatment coverage among men across the board between Haiti and most of sub-Saharan Africa. You can see it ranges from very high numbers in Zimbabwe to extraordinary low numbers in Botswana. This is our challenge. It's a challenge that can be overcome with adapting our services and adapting our programs to the needs of men. So what are we trying to do as a community? We're constantly evolving our programs using the best science and tools, and many of those tools come from the researchers that are here today and in the hallways presenting their data, and as noted by Dr. Fauci. And these are done in partnerships with communities to ensure that the program is adapted specifically to the needs and ensure that we're in sync with governments and evaluating constantly why something is not working and changing it. What have been the new innovations? We believe self-testing really brings a new ability for people to test in private, the ability to test when no one else is watching. Linking these individuals will be absolutely key to finding HIV positives and getting them on treatment. But a new innovation came out of Lesotho, who talked to men in focus groups and said, what would it take to bring you into the clinics? And they said, no women doctors. That left me out. But also said, we want to see male nurses, we want to see male doctors, and we want to see other men in the clinic. And so Lesotho, using their current infrastructure, adapted it, brought in male nurses and male physicians, and have dramatically increased the number of men seeking treatment. They added hours in the morning, hours in the evening, and weekend hours. Namibia rapidly adopted test and start immediate treatment for all people who are HIV positive, and also began initiating them quickly on day 0. This is what allowed them so quickly to get those high levels of viral load suppression in less than 2 years. They were able to adapt their program, try new things, see if it worked in the community, and they created community peer outreach workers that brought new individuals that were found to be positive into the clinic. All of this is done with continuous monitoring of data. This is the data from Rwanda. And this is looking at every single site and the viral load suppression at that site, so that sites can be prioritized and individuals can be prioritized with viremic clinics or other innovations that really focus on the people who need additional adherence counseling or additional input for improving viral load suppression. That dotted line is at 90%, so we hold ourselves at pretty high levels of accountability for viral load suppression. But I think our question on our minds this week is how do we further lower incidence? We saw for miles to go that there's still unrelenting incidence in key populations and unrelenting incidence in young women. And if you combine those two together, you could get to 70% of probably the new incident cases. Part of what we need is better regimens to ensure that people will stay on their medications, and that's why TLD is so important for us. And ensuring adherence. We continue to expand our primary prevention programs through circumcision. We've added PrEP, and I think we're very proud of the work we've done with DREAMS, working with young women specifically in the community, putting them at our center of our programming, and really working on increasing prevention for young women as well as condoms. But all of this has to be brought together where we continuously monitor for incidents of new infections with development of the recency assays. Now, by 1996, Jonathan Mann was telling us something that I think we constantly come back to. is how a problem is defined determines what will be done about it. The tools of analysis and the methods of actions must change. To ensure people can make free and informed choices about personal behavior, public health must simultaneously work at the personal, program, and societal levels. When we haven't succeeded, this may be our fundamental issue. Sometimes the problem is us as providers, us as clinicians. When we look at the treatment of children and adolescents and young adults, we saw a decreased viral load suppression beginning about 2 years ago. We asked ourselves, is this adherence? And then we found that there's been continuous use of an inferior nevirapine-based regimen in older children and young adults. And you can see this represented in Rwanda, that similar slide at the site level showing lower viral suppression in children under 15 at the same sites that had very high viral load suppression in adults and very high lower viral suppression in 15 to 24-year-olds. We've had this recent issue about women and TLD. And I think we have to ask ourselves, who is empowered? And who are we empowering for decision making? Did we do our job 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and ensure treatment literacy among our clients? So now, when we have this issue and this question, we can present the risk-benefit ratios of new drugs. Have we done the hard work to put us in a position so that we can do this now? Coming back to what Jonathan Mann said, remember he said the informed choices of personal behavior, public health systems must work at the personal, program, and societal levels. And we need to ask ourselves, are we? When we turn to West and West Central Africa, there has been slow expansion of critical prevention and treatment services. Despite significant investment per person living with HIV/AIDS, I understand that the epidemiology is complex in West and West Central Africa. But there's also been very slow adoption of new policies. There's persistent users' fees at the formal and informal level that are provide a significant barrier to access to health services. There is unrelenting stigma and discrimination keeping people from the clinics. There's lack of definitive impact every place we look, despite significant investments, and key gaps across the board. These are their surveys. Less than half of the adults are aware of their status. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's nearly only a third, and you can see their third 90 of suppression is less than any of the 90s. Again, suggesting that not only is there unrelenting stigma and discrimination, but there's unrelenting barriers to continuous access to the healthcare delivery systems. Policies matter. And if we can't change the course of this pandemic without policies that address barriers to access. Jonathan Mann went on to write in his second book that a meta-analysis of maturing epidemics, and we've heard a lot about maturing epidemics this week, reveals a common societal feature, the increasing concentration of HIV/AIDS among those who before the arrival of AIDS were already marginalized, stigmatized, and discriminated against within society. We knew this in 1996. We knew that HIV/AIDS brought out of us and showed to us where as communities we were not accepting of all. And so where are we in these primary key population epidemics? Where are we in most countries where most of the individuals who know their status, or if it's 70% or 50%, most of them are not in treatment and care? There's dismal performance across both the prevention and treatment cascades, but there's different issues with each different risk groups, and they cannot be combined together. We cannot combine transgender women with MSMs. We cannot combine MSMs with sex workers. The needs are unique. It's really told to us very clearly in the new data from UNAIDS. In one case, we have the Ukraine, who has aggressively developed a partnership between governments and civil and community-based organizations and have been rolling out services that are sensitive to the needs of the key population. And then we look at Russia, where the incidence continues to rise. Some of our greatest gaps do still exist in key population cascades, but as shown like Ukraine, countries that work through local organizations, countries that are working with peer navigators, they're achieving success. Is that model being utilized in each of these countries? This is the Ukrainian National Cascade. They are committed to increase the number of individuals on treatment to the full need by 2020. This is what's possible when governments and communities work together. And not only, they have worked tirelessly to figure out where are the people who inject drugs and what are their needs for prevention and treatment, and where are the people who are risk factors related to MSM behavior, and how do we find them and how do we treat them. Now I know after all of I've said about dreams and men, you wonder where the Key Population Investment Fund is. We remain deeply committed to this. We have $260 million programmed right now through what we call our country operational plans. But I tell you, for the last 2 years, I tried to move that $100 million in a different way, a way that governments weren't used to utilizing. And although I have never ever given up on anyone telling me no, can't be done that way, and I keep pushing, I decided 24 months in was too long. So we are now moving that money in the old way that we move money to the agencies, DOD, USAID, and CDC, with the requirements that, as with the Key Population Investment Fund's original goal, all of the money must be programmed to indigenous organizations for HIV prevention and treatment at the community level. Where are we in the developed world? Well, there's been unequal speed in the adoption of key policies. Just look at how long some of the developed world took to get to treat all. And there's a steady state of incidents across many countries, causing us to pause and ask, are we reaching prevention interventions to the groups at risk? And do we have a way to evaluate that? I am very impressed by the U=U campaign because it puts the client at the center. Puts the client at the center of the importance of ART and remaining undetectable. Key gaps exist for prevention of initial infection under adolescents. I know in the United States across the South, we have young men of color presenting with late-stage disease at 22. This means that they were infected at 14 or 15. That means we have failed in educating them around prevention interventions. Went on to say, well, while their national epidemics have slowed at the result of some effective prevention, this was 1996, larger analysis indicated a decade of analysis that the epidemic is not merely going away, it is merely shifting its focus from one and a new vulnerable population. I know you know about our dramatic increase in voluntary medical male circumcision and DREAMS. This is our circumcision cascade. We're very excited that last year we did over 3 million circumcisions, so we're further accelerating and getting to coverage to those young men and boys. But our priority is also on girls and adolescent girls to really have a structural intervention that addresses their unique needs, how we keep them in school, how we prevent early pregnancies, how we prevent sexual violence, how we continue to do post-violent care, and how we reduce child marriage. We are excited that we reached 2.5 million girls, but we're more excited that it has had an impact, and the girls are leading the way by telling us how to get better at this. This is the first 10 countries across all of the districts, and you can see in some countries we had a dramatic and high impact on reducing new incidents in Mozambique and Malawi. And then you can see 80% of the districts that were over a 25% decline, and then a different set of countries where we had highly urban programs. So we looked at all the data and trying to decide, how do we evolve this program and how do we make it more real for girls? So we've been meeting with the girls and the adolescents and young women, but we know now in analyzing and sub-analysis that we did much better in rural areas versus peri-urban and rural and urban areas. And a lot of it is due to full coverage. You need to have these programs at full scale in the community for all girls. And that's the piece that's lacking. We also did qualitative analysis, and we visited the sites. Our DREAMS team at OGAC is quite extraordinary. They're small but mighty. And they've gone out and looked at programs and found that layering is absolutely key. These structural interventions must be brought together to serve the girls' needs, and it can't be at 8 different sites. Some of the countries that had much less decrease in incidence had 8 or 9 partners working in different areas, doing different things, and girls had to move themselves from partner to partner. I want to finish with talking about the violence against children. This is the number of girls whose first sex is rape. This ranges from anywhere from 11% to 50%. This is ongoing, it's unrelenting, this is first sex, this continues, this is the number of individuals that reported sexual violence within the last 12 months. This is the young women's experience, and I think we have to ask ourselves, just as we're working against stigma and discrimination, what are we doing to change cultural and community practices that find it acceptable to rape a 13-year-old girl? We continue to access condoms and PrEP, and this is some of our PrEP data. I won't go through all of that. Progress is possible, and it's been demonstrated by using the best science and translating that and triangulating the program data and bringing qualitative and program and community surveys together has clearly shown our successes, but it's also pointed out our failures. We cannot continue to do the exact same things in the same places where we have failed. They have to be modified, and we need to address all areas of programming. Future progress will require us to address a whole series of complex issues that constantly evolve. But I was heartened in preparing this lecture because I saw that Jonathan Mann faced this in the 90s, and we made amazing progress since then. So it's not a matter of being overwhelmed by the complexity, but it's a matter of looking specifically what has to be done and holding ourselves accountable to address the lack of diagnosis in men and women at a young age, to deal with the issues of key populations and their cascade, to ensure that all have access to health services. We know who is missing in these countries now because we have clear surveys showing that, and ensuring that we have successful implementation. I won't go through all of these different I put this slide up. I know it's a lot on there, but these are the things we have to do community by community, country by country in order to be successful. And we have indicators around each and every one of them in order to work on that. I wanted to conclude with this because this is what gave me the most unbelievable optimism walking into this week. Jonathan Mann said that yet the determination to continue and seek ways to advance further against HIV/AIDS in the face of enormous challenges goes beyond a strictly rational calculation of the dangers of the epidemic. I think she kind of means we're a little crazy. But it goes on to say, perhaps the HIV/AIDS work has drawn together people who refuse to accept the unacceptable and who continue to believe that the world can change. I believe the world can change. Thank you for making it possible for me to believe that. Hopefully you believe that, and I hope when we gather in 2 years we see dramatically different key population cascades and access to services for young women. Thank you.